My name is Jan Vasbinder. I'm the director of Paralimes, who organized these lectures, to which I welcome you. It's the first of 4 lectures by Brian Arthur. And in many ways, I think they're historical because Brian will talk about the history of several important developments in the past, the complexity science, Santa Fe and Silicon Valley. And I forget one, but he'll talk about that. But it's not only that he talks about that history, he is one of the key people that made that history. And he's also a superb storyteller, which you'll find out in the course of the coming 4 days. I know Brian since, I think, 2005. I'm not quite sure. I never know precisely, but that was when we were setting up the Institute Paralimes in Europe, and I got a telephone call from Brian Arthur, about whom I had read in the book by Mitchell Waldrop, who said, I'm Brian Arthur, I'd like to be involved in this foundation of this Institute Paralimes. So a few days later he came to the founding session, and prior to the founding session we had a dinner. And I needed somebody to give a talk, a dinner talk, just to somehow give the idea what the Santa Fe Institute was, what the spirit of Santa Fe was. And then John Holland, who was also part of that meeting, said, you should ask Brian because he can tell good stories. So 10 minutes before dinner, I asked Brian to give a talk, and he looked a little bit strange time to ask, he said, but then he said yes. Then he started to talk. I asked him to speak for 10 minutes. He spoke for 45 minutes. It was a fantastic talk. It set the spirit for the founding meeting the next day. And I think it played a key role in getting Institute Paralimes going in Europe, and subsequently Paralimes in NTU, because there's a direct line between Institute Paralimes in Europe and Paralimes here. So it's a great pleasure that Brian has agreed to give these 4 lectures. But before I give the word to him, I'd like to ask Steve Lansing to introduce him in a better way than I did.
Hi, well, I'm the director of the Complexity Institute here, and you're in for a treat. I mean, I'm about to embarrass Brian. At least I think I will, because I'm going to actually tell this story. It's been my great fortune to spend a lot of time in institutes for advanced study all over the place, right, in Princeton and Stanford and Durham and Amsterdam, et cetera, Stockholm, and Vienna. So I've run into some interesting people in those places. Brian, as you're about to learn in these 4 lectures, he's accomplished 4 bodies of work, any one of which would be a major contribution to thought in our era. Any one of them, they are extraordinary. And then as Jan says, he's also a great storyteller. So this is going to be fun, and I think it's wonderful that we will have this event because each of those is treated as a discrete subject. He's famous for 4 different things, and different communities of people know about them. I don't think anybody, actually tracing the ideas that go through those things is something that maybe we begin here as we look at the threads that connect these 4 bodies of work. So you'll hear from him in a moment what those 4 topics are, I think. Let me just tell you a little bit about his background so you get some notion of how it is possible for one man to do all these things. So Brian, here's Brian's pedigree. He got his first degree, a Bachelor of Science and Engineering at Queen's Belfast, where he was at the top of the class. He got a master's degree at the University of Michigan in mathematics, followed that up with another master's degree at Lancaster in the United Kingdom in operations research. Then he took another PhD, a PhD at the University of California, Berkeley in operations research, and a PhD in economics, but he couldn't have 2 PhDs from Berkeley, so that one turned into a postdoc. He is the first winner of the Lagrange Prize in computer science. It's like the Turing Prize, but it's the first prize in computer science in 2008. So he's taught economics. No, wait a minute, I guess economics is the one subject he hasn't taught, yet he's perennially mentioned as a candidate for a Nobel Prize in economics. What he actually taught at Stanford was demography. So you can see this is going to be an interesting story. He'll start today by talking about what the Harvard Business School here, one of the, perhaps the most cited paper in the Harvard Business Review was an article that he wrote 24 years ago on increasing returns and the new world of business. And I won't say anything more. I'll say one thing about it. This is basically foundational for Silicon Valley, as you will soon hear. He wrote it and having written this paper as he was editing it, can I tell that story? He asked a friend of his to help kind of look it over. So that guy was Cormac McCarthy. And you may know that name because he has a Pulitzer for his novels. He also has an Academy Award for his films. He's a very famous writer. So Cormac had a look at this thing, and between them, Brian and Cormac polished it up, and here it is. It's the foundation for, things like Google. I mean, it's an extraordinarily influential paper. So we're going to start today. The 4 topics. We'll begin with, let me get this right now, increasing returns economics, widely considered to be the most important economic theory in technology. So we'll lead off with that, okay? Followed by the origins of the Santa Fe Institute, where he was the director of the first research program at the Santa Fe Institute, launched the research program in the Santa Fe Institute. So that's the beginnings of complexity science. And we'll hear something about Santa Fe Institute. Third lecture will be about non-equilibrium economics, also known as complexity economics. That's what he won the prize for. Economics is a field that's based on equilibrium theory. Brian has been developing a theory that is not based on stable equilibria. You'll hear about that. Okay, that's extraordinary work. And then finally, amazingly, technology. He's leading theorist, probably the leading theorist on the evolution of technology, on how technology evolves. So those are the 4 topics. We'll hear about them, I think, more or less in that order, but we'll also be hearing about and thinking about the ways in which, what connects them, what could possibly connect all those ideas in the work of one guy. So, Brian, so pleased to be here.
Well, I'm delighted to be here, and I will try to live up to what Jan said and what Steve said. Just sitting there, it reminds me about my father, who was a great raconteur and storyteller, very, very witty. And I remember him being boxed into a corner. Somebody said that at a gathering, Bill, that was my father, "Oh, Bill's very funny. Say something funny, Bill." So I feel I'm in this position of tell a good story, Brian. Anyway, I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted you're all here, and I must say I'm deeply flattered that Jan set this up, and flattered to see so many people I know and respect here. A fair number of faces I recognize. I'll be giving 4 lectures. The first is, and 2 of them sound quite arcane. I hope they won't be, because they actually matter in the economy. I'm talking about increasing returns, which is basically to do with positive feedbacks in the economy. Then talking about complexity and how I got caught up in it. And we might we'll have a word from a couple of other leading theorists in complexity in this lecture tomorrow. On Monday, I will talk about a new, very general way of looking at the economy that we got going in Santa Fe, and then on the evolution of technology. And this last one's project I've been working on with Stefan, who's here in the audience, Stefan Turner, who's in charge of the Complexity Hub in Vienna. So it's a varied menu. I'm thrilled to be here, as I said, and let me just pitch in. One of the things I want to do as I go is talk about not just what I did or what other people working with me did. I want to talk about the atmosphere of these various different disciplines at the time. A lot of this work ranges from the early 1970s on through to today. And this work was done in an atmosphere that's radically different from the sort of one that's beginning to take over these days. I want to also here and there point out things that I wish I had known roughly when I was your age. I knew nothing about science or nothing about how the whole thing works, nothing about how wonderful it could be, nothing about how catty it could be, nothing about all the obstacles you would run into in a career. I knew basically nothing. I came from a family and a background where nobody had been at university, and the only people you might know who had ever been at a university would be the family doctor. And they weren't talking, they were sort of poking at you. So I didn't know anybody who'd been at a university. That wasn't unusual. Where I grew up, which was Northern Ireland, Belfast, the number of people who went to university, or the proportion, was 4%, 1 out of 25 or so. And I was very proud to go to university. It took me 5 months to discover I was an undergraduate. We didn't use that expression. We thought we were students. I'm a student at the university. But there was some pronouncement or other talking about being undergraduates. And I thought, oh my God, is that right? I'd heard the expression. A bit later, I decided the people teaching me were doctors so-and-so, Dr. somebody else. I thought, that would be nice. I looked up the rules. It said you needed at least 20 years of experience, you needed to be extremely distinguished, you needed to belong to the Royal Society, you needed this, that, and the other. I was looking up DSCs, which are a very high form of honorary doctorate. I wasn't looking up PhDs. I didn't even know what a PhD was. So please take it that I was starting with a totally blank slate and in a state of ignorance, and not unusual in Europe at that time. Also, so I want to talk about the ups and downs. For me, the bottom line is that I have had a wonderful time, fantastic time doing research, and I feel extraordinarily lucky to have sort of parachuted into this lifetime and been able to do research. I could get up in the morning, go to St. John's College in Santa Fe and think about things and then write them down, and you're sleuthing all the time, and you go, oh my God, can that be true? Everybody, or probably all of you, share some of that. Steve was just saying that there's 2 species of hominin, if I got that right, that have been discovered by people at NTU in the last short while by sleuthing, and you could hear the excitement in his voice. So this is the atmosphere I come from. On the other hand, so that's the good fairy. The day I was born, the good fairy says, oh, you're going to have a job doing research. This will be wonderful. And the bad fairy shows up, and the bad fairy says, but you're going to have a career in academia, and you won't believe the hassles you're going to get into, and you won't believe the positive things in academia. For me, it's been what we call in the UK snakes and ladders. You go up one ladder and then you're down near the bottom again, you go up another one. Americans call that chutes and ladders. They don't like snakes, and that's all been cleaned up. So what I do want to expound on here and there is what I wish to God I had known when I was 24 years old or 30 years old. I found out the hard way, and it wasn't, some of it was wonderful, a lot of it was difficult, as you'll hear. Also, I began to think, well, these are different topics. Is there any theme to what I'm saying? And it reminded me that about 7 or 8 years ago, I was 60 and 60 plus anyway, and I thought, you know something, I've been in engineering mathematics, I've been in population studies or demography, economic theory, I've been in technology, I've been in complexity, all those different subjects, and I thought, what's wrong with me? Am I just flitting around from one blossom to another? Surely that means I'm a dilettante, and many of you might have had the same experience, or might in the future, and I encourage you to keep changing fields if you're in academia or in research as often as you feel like. But I got quite despondent. I thought, well, I've wasted a lot of my time just sort of, as English should say, banging on about different topics without pausing much. Every 10 years or every 7 or 8 years, I'd change my field. And then I began to realize there was a common theme. This was much to my relief. Common theme was that I have always been looking at systems that were changing, about evolutionary things that were unfolding, and my fascination is time and things that unfold over time. So if you're wondering, what is he talking about this time and why is it so different from the previous one? That's the common thread. And I started to wonder for these talks, could I say there's a common theme? Is there anything that really, is there a message that I've had? And I really do believe there's a message. The message is this. And I'm talking about the 20th century, but it carries over into this century. We have tended to view the world as highly orderly, highly machine-like. All you need to do is fiddle and twist the dials. Jan was trained this way too, I'm sure. I can see many of you were. But there's something inside me screaming, you know, well, the world isn't orderly. It's not a machine. It is really an organic thing that's changing, and one layer follows on top of another, and it's one thing after another. Surely we can do better than seeing that. So this is the theme that's going to run throughout these talks. The world isn't perfectly orderly. It's certainly not a machine. It's not very predictable, and history matters like crazy. All that got ruled out in the 20th century. In fact, it was ruled out in the High Enlightenment in the 1700s. Why? Because everybody was stunned and dazzled by Isaac Newton, and rightly so. All these planetary orbits where you could predict things down to fractions of an inch. Halley's Comet would return, you could predict all sorts of things. I'll tell you a personal story here very quickly that added a bit of insight, and this is very personal to me. I don't admit to this very much, but for about 30 years I've studied Taoism, or Tao, and I was invited up about 3 years ago to Beijing by a Taoist master, and he held a dinner in my honor, and I was very flattered, and he'd got about 16 Taoists around the table, all Chinese. Not much English was spoken, but there was a translator. And so these were, think Hogwarts if you want, whatever, you know, a strange bunch of animals, but they were all Taoists and all Chinese. I shouldn't say that, I should. Anyway, so, would I give a short introduction? So for about 5 minutes I said, oh, no, I'm trained as an engineer, mathematician, blah, 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 born in Ireland. And then I thought I'd connect with the audience, and I said, you know, I was born in Ireland, but I think when I came into this lifetime, I was heading for China. But somehow the wrong button got pushed, and the re-entry wasn't very good, and I landed at the opposite end of Eurasia, which is Ireland, and got born there by mistake. And everybody giggled and smiled, and I thought, that's it, I connected. And about half an hour later, after a number of drinks, there was this tug on my sleeve, and it was the master, Shifu. I don't know if Sifu in Cantonese. The master grabs my sleeve. He says, "Don't say you were born in Ireland by accident. No accident." I said, "What do you mean?" You know, for me, it was a bit of a joke. I said, "What do you mean?" He's very, very serious about it. He said, "You weren't born in the West by accident. You came here to teach people Tao, but Westerners can't understand Tao. So what did you do? You came into the West and you taught them Tao, parading as science." He says, "They get science, they don't get Tao." So I said, "But science isn't Tao." He says, "Yes, it is." He says, "Complexity science is pure Tao." So anyway, I was flattered. I thought, if that's what I'm here for, to show the world is organic and changing and everything's swirling and one thing's leading to another, which is very much the spirit of Taoism, I thought, I'm all for that. I just didn't know that I was teaching that as complexity, and many of us are. So there is a theme, and that is that the world is basically organic and always changing, and it's not necessarily an equilibrium. It's certainly not optimal. I want to start these talks quite arbitrarily. I thought, where could I start? I could start last year, but I want to start quite arbitrarily in 1969, where I was about 24, if you're trying to calculate all this. And so it started in 1969, and I'm in a helicopter, and literally in a helicopter, and it's just landing in California, in Berkeley. That's how I arrived in Berkeley. I'd been working for McKinsey & Company as a management consultant in Düsseldorf in Germany. I had plenty of money, and when I got to San Francisco, there used to be a little helicopter service. It was terribly expensive, cost $12. I forked out the $12 to get to Berkeley by helicopter, landed very grandly. What I didn't know and wasn't prepared for what awaited me in Berkeley. I'll give you some ideas here. Talk about mind-blowing experience. My son is here, so I can't say too much about all of this, but it wouldn't surprise him. He grew up in California. I had spent 2 years in the US already at the University of Michigan. I didn't know John Holland was there, Kenneth Boulding was there, and I think Steve Lansing may still have been there in 1967. And back to Ireland, back to Belfast. The British Army moved in to occupy Northern Ireland in August 1969. We had choppers all over the place. We had armored vehicles. We had tanks running down the streets. We had tear gas. We had the whole thing. I don't want to say I blame them. Ireland, or Northern Ireland, was in an uproar. I was so relieved when I got on the plane, landed in San Francisco, took the helicopter over to Berkeley, and what did I find in Berkeley? Armored vehicles, tear gas, choppers all over the place, uniformed soldiers on the ground as the National Guard. Ronald Reagan, who eventually signed my PhD certificate, was governor, and he had sent the Blue Meanies, that's the Alameda County Sheriff's Department, and the National Guard to quell all the uprising in Berkeley. It was a different cause, but the atmosphere was exactly the same. Just before I got to Berkeley, one student had been shot in the People's Park incident, so this was for real. I wound up in International House. There are two things in Berkeley that sort of didn't quite jibe, and one of them was that along with all the occupation by the army and by the National Guard and whatnot, were hippies, people with flowers in their hair, people who'd come out to hate Ashbury. for the most part, they weren't students, but there was a whole hippie culture. I'd be going down Bancroft Avenue, and I remember a guy sort of staggering up to me, and very long hair, mustaches down to here, which eventually I adopted as well. Fu Manchu mustaches. And he comes up to me and says, hey man, can you tell me where the free clinic is? And of course, we all knew, oh, just go down there, turn right, and then 3 blocks, and whatever. It was when the authorities tried to break up the free clinic, we knew this was serious. The other thing, and this is really where I want to take off from, was that there was an atmosphere in Berkeley, like the rest of the United States, where if you did science, you saw the world as very mathematical, literally mathematical. The world was highly ordered. The world, everything was sort of structured. I was in operations research. Berkeley was a staggeringly brilliant place to be. It had stellar people because it had been collecting them from the 1920s on. The chancellor of Berkeley, Robert Gordon Sproul, in the 1920s decided he wanted to hire a couple of physicists. Berkeley wasn't known. So he calls up friends. He said, somebody at Yale or something. He says, who are the best young postdoc physicists in the country? And the guy says, oh, I don't know. He says, but I can tell you 2 pretty good ones. There's one called Ernest Lawrence, and there's another one at Yale, his friend, called Robert Oppenheimer. So Berkeley makes them an offer they can't refuse, and they come out by car, bumping along across the US, and whenever it was, 1920-something, and start a really good department of physics. I mean, really good department of physics that eventually leads to Los Alamos and the consequences thereof. Berkeley was amazing. I do remember meeting Yerzy Neyman of Neyman Pearson, Lem of fame. I don't know if any of you are statisticians. He was about 80. But they had a collection of people, not to speak of Nobel Prizes, they had a collection of people where you were kind of interacting all the time, not with the top people in California, but with the top people in the world, not all of them. And the main thing I got out of Berkeley, well, among many other things, by the way, I say to people that I got a real education in Berkeley. Oh, and the academic side was also pretty good. But what I really got out of Berkeley was this feeling, oh, I just met whoever it was, with a Nobel Prize. And the guy looked normal. I mean, this looked like a standard human being. Well, I'm a standard human being. Maybe I can do something. And previously in Belfast or Lancaster or Michigan, I hadn't quite had that feeling. So I was very, very much taken with this idea. But Berkeley was extremely mathematical, and they believed very much in order, in predictability of everything. I was in operations research, which is a mathematical subject of how to optimize systems. Once you understood the equations that ran those systems, you could tweak the equations, maybe continuously over time, and thereby optimize the whole thing. That's not particularly easy. I found it quite rigorous and quite difficult. My 4th year there, I showed up in my advisor's office. His name was Stuart Dreyfus. He was proud that by that stage, he was on Richard Nixon's enemies list because he'd been at the Rand Corporation. And he was brother of Hubert Dreyfus, who had been arrested for growing pot and was the chairman of the philosophy department. So you get the atmosphere in Berkeley, super academic, but super sort of, oh yeah, sure. I go into Dreyfus's office. He says, you've been here 4 years. He said, we're cutting your funding off at the end of this academic year. That's in 9 months' time. I'll give you a mathematical problem. He was a mathematician. He says, if you can solve this problem, you have your PhD. Okay, I said, it's like a doctor writing a prescription. He says, here's the problem, gives me the problem. The problem was how to control things where the controls are very time delayed, and how to do that rigorously and mathematically. So officially that's called the optimal control problem with linear dynamics. So the equations were unfolding over time, a quadratic criterion with Gaussian noise and time delays. Think of it this way. You have a satellite out near Jupiter. You want to control it over time, make sure it's pointing in the right direction, but it's about, let's say it's 8 minutes away or 20 minutes away, whatever it would be in the solar system. You do something like that. It doesn't get your signal for 10 or 20 minutes. And then it responds, and you say, oops, overdid it there. It's like trying to adjust the shower tap when there's a time delay in the pipes. Some people had solved this problem, Russians mainly. Optimal control theory, of which this was a part, was very much a Russian subject and been heavily influenced and introduced by a Russian mathematician called Lev Pontryagin. I was later to meet Pontryagin, who turned out to be a rather small man who was blind. He was a blind topologist, and his mother led him around, explaining who was there and what. But either in spite of being blind or because of being blind, he had fantastic spatial insight and had pretty much pioneered optimal control theory in the Soviet Union. It spilled over into the United States, the Rand Corporation, all these people who did optimal everything, and landed on my shoulders in 1992. I was given this problem. A few people had solved a few special cases, but the overall problem as a mathematical one was open, meaning nobody had solved it. The other part, by the way, of the problem is that the signals you're getting as to where your system is, maybe a satellite, are out of date too. It signals, oh, I'm over here, but that was 10 minutes ago. So you're trying to figure out where it's going, where it is, everything's delayed. How do you optimize that? By the way, the person who's behind that's called Rudolf Kallmann. And I once met him too. I went up to Kenneth Arrow's office in Stanford, where I was working much later, 20 years later. Arrow's there, he's got a smile on his face. Oh, Brian, he says, this is Rudy Kallmann. I said, oh, wow, one of my heroes. Kallmann, the engineer. Kallmann looks at me. No, I'm Kallmann, the mathematician. So anyway, this is what I was working on, and I couldn't solve the problem. I read this, I read that. The problem was given me in October. By Christmas, I'd lost about 20 pounds. I'd lost 10 kilos or so. I was looking gaunt. My mother came out. She was worried about my health. I'd turned sort of greenish-yellow color. And this was in California. I couldn't solve the problem. But I stuck to it. So Easter came. I still hadn't solved the problem, and I couldn't solve it. And finally, I got my courage up and went to my advisor's office, and I said, I can't solve this problem. You know, would you kindly write something? I'll turn the crank. And he says, sure. He says, don't be upset. By the way, he had beads and long hair. And he said, oh, no, don't be upset. He said, you can't solve it, but don't forget nobody else has been able to solve it either. So I took some heart, but I was really, really upset and ashamed, and I gave it up. And I wrote a dissertation, or at least wrote down, solved some other problems where I knew what the method ought to be, and this was pretty safe. About 3 months later, in June 1973, I was sitting in the main library in Berkeley, and I don't know, was I reading something or writing down something, but I'd long given up that problem. And suddenly I got this flash like, "You've got mail," you know. I thought, "What?" "You've got the answer to something." And I said, "Oh, all right. What does that mean?" "Well, you have to take a certain matrix, and then you have to partition the matrix, so that gives you little matrices inside the big matrix. And then you invert the partitioned matrix, and that's it. You have the solution." I said, "Oh, all right. What's the problem?" Because, you know, you've got an answer, here's the answer. I said, "Okay, but what's the question?" "Oh." And this is all sort of coming into my mind, you know, I'm just sitting there. It wasn't voices. Nobody was saying, "Brian, you have the..." It was really, boom, "Oh, you've got an answer. Oh, all right. The answer is about partition matrices getting inverted. Got it. What's the problem?" Problem is the linear quadratic control theory. Control problem with time, continuous time delays. And I thought, oh. So it took me another 5 to 10 seconds to figure out, put the whole thing together, the problem, the solution. I remember walking out of the main library feeling very satisfied. Oh, I could see how to do it now. For 2 more months, I did nothing on it. I don't know why. And I think this is very typical research. I didn't do anything. I didn't try to verify it. I just knew that this was correct. And I happened to be visiting my girlfriend in Washington, D.C., mother of someone here. And I was visiting her in Washington, D.C., and I got on a plane. I was working in Honolulu. This is the advantage of California. So I was working in Honolulu. I got on the plane. I took out a yellow pad. It was a 10-hour flight from DC to Honolulu. And I started to write down the problem. And when I got off the plane, I had my dissertation written. It took 10 hours. I'm not saying that's the way it works all the time. But this was the first wake-up call. I wasn't sure I could do research at all. I hadn't done anything. I had given up the problem. But nevertheless, something inside was working, and I think that this is generally true for many people, or probably for all of you, that things rummage around inside you, and then when you have the key idea, you say, oh, this is simple. And I'm always struck by the simplicity of ideas if they're correct, and how obvious they are. I want to turn to economics and spend some time talking about, this was also in Berkeley. I arrived in Berkeley from Germany, and I had been working for McKinsey in Germany and seeing how the German economy was laid out. We would take private planes, go down the Rhine, and my friend on the team would say, Shell owns 51% of that, the Deutsche Bank owns 46% of that, and I was getting aerial view of the whole German economy. I came to Berkeley wondering how economies worked. And I encountered my advisor, whose name was David Gale. He was a mathematician. Gale looks at my letter and says, "Oh, you're getting interested in the economy." Gale, by the way, was a famous mathematician. People talked about man years and Gale minutes. Gale had written a paper at Rand with Lloyd Shapley called The Marriage Problem. It was an algorithm for matching. It's used now in college entrances all over, the Gale-Shapley algorithm. Gale died before he could get a Nobel for that, but Lloyd Shapley, his co-author picked up the Nobel for that one. So I go into Gale's office, quite austere-looking mathematician. He says, "You're interested in the economy. What have you been reading?" I said, "Samuelson." "Great," says Gale. "Samuelson, wonderful book." Paul Samuelson, the enfant terrible of economics, had written this fabulous book on the economy. Very arcane, very mathematical, showing how the economy could be viewed in the 1940s. This was his dissertation. He got a Nobel for this too. You're going to hear a lot of these people who were awarded the Riksbank Memorial Prize in memory of Alfred Nobel. Samuelson had written this treatise showing how the economics could be not imperfectly mathematized, but completely and utterly mathematized. And so Gale says, great glee, says, "Samuelson's Foundations, wonderful book." And then I said nothing, and then he stared at me and the penny dropped. He said, "You do mean the Foundations, don't you?" "No," I said, "I mean the elementary textbook." I'd been reading Samuelson. It was as if, I don't know, I'd read the comic book version. So I was off to a very bad start in economics. Economics at Berkeley, and this is by way of background, was very much an endeavor, similarly to operations research. If you knew the equations, if you knew everything, the whole economy could be made mathematical. One of my professors, Gérard Debreu, yet another Nobel Prize winner, believed as a mathematician that if you just knew the axioms of the economy, you could deduce everything about an economy. That turned out not to be true, thank God, but Debreu was greatly honored for this. In fact, David Gale had said, "Why didn't you go to Debreu's lectures?" And I sort of said, no. So in Berkeley, the economy was regarded as an equation system. One of my professors comes in, I was studying economic development. Ireland was sort of a third world country at the time, maybe a bit like Singapore in those days, developing, but not very well off. So I studied economic development. And economic development, I'll give you a hint of this at Berkeley. One of my professors, I won't mention his name, another distinguished economist comes in, and he says, he writes on the blackboard in those days, big capital squiggle E. He says, "Let capital squiggle E be the set of all economies. Then let capital squiggle D of capital squiggle E be the set of all developing economies." And I'm sitting there. I had been in places like Turkey. I'd come from Ireland, and I'm thinking, what? So I walked out of that class. Later, I became a development economist. I taught in Kuwait. I taught in Syria. I went to Bangladesh and Nepal and India, et cetera, but I can assure you they don't work as mathematical entities very well. So how do they work? So Berkeley was very much into mathematizing everything and making sure everything was optimal. One of the key things I started to look at was the whole idea of diminishing returns. And this was just stuff I was wondering at in the lectures in Berkeley. Economics was presented to me as a set of theorems. And even years afterwards, I thought of economics as a bunch of theorems. I think if you've been luckier, maybe Stefan has, you could have seen it more in more narrative terms than that, but theorem, etc. And then there was usually no proof, and then the next theorem. And I believed this stuff, you know. Anyway, so the economy was regarded very, very mathematically. And the standard view of economics, and let me just go through very quick bit of economic history, really, or the history of thought in economics. There's superb economists from Adam Smith and even before that on up until about 1870, and they regarded the economy narratively. They regarded it as quite organic. It was populated by human beings. If you read Adam Smith, or if you read later J.S. Mill or Marx, who turned out to be a super economist, you will see human beings. Human beings and machines and what they're doing and what their institutions are. From about 1870 onwards, mathematics enters economics, in particular algebra and equations. And what else enters economics is general equilibrium theory, borrowed from physics in the 1880s and 1890s by Léon Walras, who's French, worked in Switzerland, trained as an engineer and knew quite a bit of physics. They mathematized parts of economics, and the history of the whole 20th century is the history of those parts of the economy viewed mathematically. Samuelson was a landmark in this with his Foundations, the book I hadn't read, and Kenneth Arrow and a few others. Arrow had been trained as a mathematician, and Kenneth Arrow came in and, along with Debreu, mathematized and perfected the mathematics of general equilibrium theory in the 1950s. And I was entering this about 20 years later, and that's where the field sat. It was a mathematical field. To make the mathematics work, you had to assume in the economy an awful lot of negative feedback. Think of where the economy can be as like a cornflakes bowl, and the state of the economy is a ball bearing rolling around this cornflakes bowl. What you're able to show in general equilibrium theory, if you wheel up enough conditions, is that with all this concavity of the cornflakes bowl, the ball will, there's only one place the ball can finish up, and that's at the bottom of the cornflakes bowl, and that's optimal. And it's unique if you wheel up enough axioms and conditions. And then what if the cornflakes bowl is traveling in a car? The ball bearing gets bumped around, but in a sort of homeostasis where the ball bearing's always returning to this bottom of the cornflakes bowl. I don't want to exaggerate, I don't want to make fun of this. General equilibrium theory is elegant, it's beautiful, and it's breathtakingly gorgeous. But whether that's reality, I would say, well, stay tuned if that's reality, but at the time I was a bit bothered that this was a bit too nice. In particular, that showed the economy, as long as there was enough diminishing returns or negative feedback, to be predictable. You know it's going to end up at the bottom of the cornflakes bowl. History didn't matter, ends up at the bottom of the cornflakes bowl, no matter where the ball bearing had been before. It was efficient or optimal or Pareto optimal or whatever you want. That's the bottom of the cornflakes bowl. And all of this was super orderly. But in the 1800s, economists had started to worry, what if there were increasing returns? And these were just little worries. It was kind of like a sunny day, and a cloud or two appears on the horizon, and you think, oh, okay. But tiny little clouds. So here's one. Economists started to think about economic development. And what about Italy? Well, Italy had developed economically, and if you went back to 1400 or so, you'd say, well, places like Naples in the south of Italy, places south of Florence, even Rome, very important. And some places like Venice or Milan are also important, but you couldn't quite say what would happen. By the 19th century, northern Italy was heavily industrialized. South of Italy was not. And people were starting to think, well, what was it about northern Italy? It turned out nothing was that special. They started to argue. The real mechanism people began to realize was that if you start a cluster of industry, say in Turin, it attracts more industry. Then it attracts skilled workers from the other part of Italy. That gets bled free of capital, and that's bled free of skills. And suddenly you get one part of the country highly developed and another not. You can see this all over Europe, by the way. But if history had been different, maybe the south of Italy, area around Naples, could have been staggeringly well off, and northern workers go down to the south. By the way, it's said that people who have come from countries victorious in war, think of England or think of America up until the Vietnam War, tend to favor the inevitability and optimality of history. That's the way it had to be. Why? Because Britain is superior. Why? Because we're English. Whereas people who come from nations that were defeated in war, Ireland, etc., say, well, damn it, could have been different if history had gone the other way. Scotland's another one. So economists by the 1800s and early 1900s were starting to wonder, what about increasing returns? They realized there could be multiple solutions to the economy. Economists call that equilibria, multiple equilibria. So here's Alfred Marshall, the great English economist, genuinely superb economist, in 1891, Cambridge, and he's musing. All of this is in Appendix H to his Principles of Economics. He says, okay, start N firms off, all the same, they're all identical, and they all have diminishing costs, meaning the more they produce, the cheaper it gets. That's increasing returns. The more you produce, the more advantage you have because producing is getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. Appendix H. It's not in the main text. This is what will happen. He says the market will likely go to whichever, this is literally the quote, to whichever firm first gets off to a good start. So your cornflakes bowl now is upside down. Think of it as a bowling alley. You can bowl the ball down the middle. It's an infinitely long bowling alley, but the ball's going to fall off sooner or later, bumping along. Maybe gusts of wind will fall into this side gutter or that one. You don't know which. So Marshall says that whichever firm first gets off to a good start, and then he realizes, but that could be any one of them in principle. Maybe everything wasn't perfectly balanced, but still with sufficient luck, the firm that first gets off to a good start takes the market. This is well before Google, by the way, or Facebook. And then he gives up. And then fast forward to my hero, Joseph Schumpeter, the patron saint, I hope, of the Complexity Hub in Vienna. I don't know if he was an early member, but anyway. Schumpeter, who's writing a history of economic thought, doesn't like multiple equilibria. Well, the outcome could be this, however it could be that, or it could be this. And he remarks that multiple equilibria may exist, he says, but we can't really allow them because they would produce, in his words, a chaos that is not under analytical control. Economists didn't know what to do. If you allow positive feedbacks, could go this way, small deviations get amplified, this locks in, could go that way. What are you going to do? So there might be multiple solutions. In fact, it's very easy. Here's a question. If a standard like typewriter keyboard, the arrangement of letters in a keyboard, were sufficiently prevalent, you'd have to learn that standard. Well, hang on, if you learn that standard, the typewriters, if everybody knows the standard's prevalent, typewriters are going to be produced in that standard. Typewriter teachers will know that standard. Well, how many such keyboards would there be? If you count the number of letters on a keyboard, I think I've done this, it could be, anyway, I remember counting up all the rows, about 54. Well, so in principle, you could have 54 factorial keyboards, just rearranging. That's a lot of equilibria. And I have a lot of fun. Well, there could be this outcome. Well, you could have that outcome. But luckily, there's never many. Are you joking? You know, think of all the ways that English could have, all the different words, all the different borrowings, etc. So I was getting interested in this, but again, like this earlier problem I was telling you in control theory, my thesis, I couldn't solve it. I don't know what to do. Economists were beginning to recognize that realistically, there wasn't just one solution or one equilibrium. Like economists think of all these forces as being balanced, so nobody has any incentive to deviate. That's an equilibrium. Economists were saying all these forces could balance here, or they could equally balance there, and this was becoming embarrassing. Well, I didn't know what to do about it, and I began to notice, as I was reading economic development and studying that, this was recurring. And I asked my professors, you know, what if there are not diminishing returns on the margin? What if there were increasing? Well, yes, let's go on to the next theorem. And we'll assume diminishing returns. So it's like, there can only be one outcome for a ball in a cornflakes bowl. If you assume the cornflakes bowl is shaped like a cornflakes bowl, what if it isn't? Ball could end up many different places. I didn't know what to do about this, and then I started to read a lot of biology. In 1979, I was working in a think tank in Vienna called IASA, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, and I managed to get myself seconded to the East-West Center in Honolulu, back to Hawaii, and I picked up a book in California along the way by Horace Freeland Judson. It was called The Eighth Day of Creation. Big, thick book. It's the history of molecular biology, and particularly it talks about Jacques Monod and his friend Jacob, François Jacob, and the people who figured out gene expression and the whole timing of that. Monod had written a monograph called, in English, Chance and Necessity, pointing out that some small things pushed you this way or that way, and then they would lock in. I'm going, oh God, theoretical biologists know all about this. Amazing, wow. But they weren't telling me or anyone else how to solve this problem of multiple equilibria. Then I started to read some nonlinear theoretical physics, probably nothing that would challenge some of you. It was by Hermann Haken when I was at IASA, and he was talking about the physics of lasers. You get something called mode locking in lasers. It could lock into this mode or that mode or another mode. I can see you know plenty about this. And what difference did that make? Well, they had the mathematics of dealing with this. And then somebody told me about a professor in Brussels called Ilya Prigogine and gave me one of his papers to read. Prigogine is not held in high regard these days, but Prigogine had the right ideas. I read this in June 1969, I read this essay by Prigogine where he says, oh, systems can lock into this pattern or that pattern or another. I began to realize that you could start an island. This is one of my thought experiment examples. I'd been in Kauai, in Hawaii, one of the islands, when the first traffic light was installed. And so that led to this following thought experiment. What if there were no cars in that island? And Milton Friedman is in charge of the island. That may not mean much to you, a great libertarian economist. Milton Friedman's the governor of the island, and he says, you are free to choose as a driver which side you'll drive on. And there's no biases, all the steering wheels are in the middle, so you come back 6 months later, what do you see? You see tons of wreckage, but you also see on that island all the cars have lined up on the left, and reproduce the thing in a different island that Milton Friedman's wife is running. She was also similar, and cars have all lined up on the right. Nobody forced this. It's just that if more people are driving on the left by chance early on, then you're going to have to go along with that. If more people drive on the right, you're going to get killed if you keep driving on the left. So people are free to choose, but they start to line up. So I read Prigogine, I read Jacques Monod, and I had this thought experiment, and I suddenly realized I had a way to deal with increasing returns problems or positive feedbacks. My idea was to slow the whole thing down and look at it step by step, and rather than think we can get this equilibrium, we can get that equilibrium, and it's indeterminate which side of the road emerges, why not look at the whole thing step by step as a random process that's non-linear? So I did that. So I thought, well, if it's a random process and non-linear, I can apply stochastic process theory. Now, if you're not familiar with that, just think of that as the equivalent in dynamics of probability theory. So what I decided to do is I would model all the small events in one of these problems. One person starts a typewriter, another one somewhere else starts a different keyboard typewriter, another one starts something else, and then people start event by event to adopt those typewriters. And under small random events, if you allow some probability, different types of people showing up, somebody talking to someone on an aircraft, someone having different tastes, maybe the government putting its hand on the scales, you might get different small events. And all I had to do, and this was all I had to do, was to learn enough nonlinear probability theory, in other words, nonlinear stochastic process theory. I could nail this whole thing. I couldn't see how to do that. I didn't know enough probability theory. I shared an office with what we then called a Soviet colleague, Yuri Ermoliev, a wonderful man. And I asked Ermoliev, I said, what do you know about nonlinear stochastic processes? I said, I've got this problem, could we put it in that form? He says, Brian, not possible. So nothing happened. I started to study like crazy nonlinear. If you want to crack anything, first comes the idea, then comes the technique. In fact, it was Ermoliev taught me that. He says, Brian, great composer. First comes theme of symphony, after orchestration. So you have to write for 35 different instruments, etc., etc. But the theme, according to the Ermoliev theory of science, first comes the theme. My theme was, small events, stochastic process, non-linear, but how do I get that to work? Ask Ermoliev. Ermoliev said, not possible. I think a year went by, or maybe several months, sitting at my desk. Ermoliev's at the other desk. I can still see this in the Schloss at Yassa. He said, Brian, you still interested in problem with multiple equilibria? I said, yes, I am, Yuri. Brian, maybe we can solve this. He goes to the board, writes down his theory. He was from the Skorohod school of probability theory. I even met the great Skorohod one day in Ukraine. They knew how to do probability theory. So Ermoliev pointed out the key mechanisms, even the key textbook. Luckily, it was Russian, but it was translated into English. I learned the whole thing, and we cracked it. Before that, I had written a paper at Yassa with the title of Competing Technologies. So these would be several different technologies, like typewriter keyboards, competing technologies, increasing returns, and lock-in by small historical events. And I hadn't used any fancy probability theory, just random walk theory, which is probabilistic. And that was in 1983. I brought the paper out as a Yassa working paper, and I sent it to the American Economic Review. I wrote this paper, and I sort of beheld it afterwards. I don't know where the paper had come from, but I wrote the thing. It was single-authored. I thought, this is neat. It was showing that under diminishing returns, everything would be balanced and there'd be a single equilibria. Under increasing returns, which I could twiddle with a parameter, you'd bounce around in the middle, but if you went off, like in the bowling alley, if you went off to the side, game over, one technology would lock in. But you didn't know in advance which one it would be. So I'm very proud of the paper. I sent it to the American Economic Review, and I thought, this is a slam dunk. I've solved a big problem in economics, the increasing returns problem. Came back, terribly sorry. We can't find any technical faults in your reasoning. However, this is not economics. I sent it to the Quarterly Review, QJE, Quarterly Journal of Economics, Harvard. Terribly sorry. It looks to be rigorously done and proper, but we don't recognize this as an economic problem or indeed as economic theory. I sent it to the Economic Journal, similar review. I sent it back to the AAR because the editor had changed. And I thought, he didn't like it, I'll send to the new editor. Comes back. 6 years went by, still no publication. I wrote the paper in 1983. And finally, by that time, the paper was getting samizdat circulation, if you know what that expression is. It just means the paper had gone underground. All the key theorists knew about it. Many of them, including Ken Arrow, liked it. And the paper was sort of getting this damn it type of reception. Damn it, why isn't this in a journal? Damn it, why do we have to keep citing a working paper? So I sent it back to the Economic Journal in England with a couple of damn it letters. You know, damn it, why isn't this thing published? So by popular acclaim, they published it in 1989, only 6 years after it had been written. Well, it's okay, Jan, I want to go. We did start a bit later. So, so the paper finally got published, but along the way, I gave a talk on the paper at Harvard, and somebody there, I won't say who, jumped up and said, what you're saying is it's a thought experiment, but it can't really exist. I said, why not? Well, with perfect insurance markets, with perfect this market, with perfect that market, you'd get a single equilibrium that would be perfectly efficient. And I thought, well, you know, if there were perfect fairies around and if pigs were truly able to fly, maybe the world would be wonderful. 6 months later, I gave exactly the same talk in Moscow at CEMI, the Central Economic Mathematical Institute in Moscow. And I said, therefore, you can lock in to one of many solutions with small events determining which you lock into. And where you wind up may not be the best possible outcome. We all speak English by increasing returns. My ancestors didn't. I'll bet your ancestors didn't either. But we all speak English. If small events in history, actually in Europe, had been slightly different, if you wanted to make bets in the 1500s, you might have said we'll all end up speaking Latin as a common language. 1700s, we'll all end up speaking French. 1800s, a lot of the center of Europe spoke German. All right, we'll speak German. And then finally, this language from some tiny, insignificant island, which I can say being Irish, tiny, insignificant island takes over all the entire world, and the story is not over yet. It might be Mandarin in 100 or indeed in 50 years' time. But so small events can bring you into something like that. But who's to say English is optimal or any other outcomes optimal? Well, anyway, my paper kept getting turned down, not because people were mean, although I'm willing to, that could be a hypothesis. But I think it kept getting turned down because Western journals, in particular American ones, I was basically saying if you leave a free capitalist market to itself, you might not end up in the best possible one. Took the same story to Russia, and hand shoots up in the audience at the end. Vladimir Mikhailov, who had an Order of Lenin pin, very, very nice one, says, Professor, this cannot happen in Soviet Union, only in capitalist countries. So I said, well, all right, why not? Because we have superior socialist planning and we always end up with correct solution. I rushed back to Stanford, put a PhD student onto the problem right away. He wiped it out. Not true. Even with a lot of look ahead, there's no way you can say with any technology or anything, we're going to get it right, because you don't know how that technology will improve over time or whether it's got a lot of possibility. Anyway, so super obstacles all the way. And then a colleague of mine, before I could get my paper into the economic journal, Paul David, who was chair of the economics department, produced his own version of the same story. He'd been thinking along those lines himself, but suddenly that created a sensation. He wrote it in English prose, and arguing history was important. It was a rather lovely paper he wrote, but that took the wind totally out of my sails. And I think it led to a whole idea that by the time my paper came out, I had taken somebody else's, Paul David's, ideas and mathematized them. So this was not an easy time. I did have backers, though. Kenneth Arrow was solidly behind me, Martin Schubik, these are superb economists, and quite a few others were saying, this stuff needs to be published, it should be published, and it's important. I want to just say where the tide turned. It'll take me another 5 minutes or so, Jan. I got the paper published in 1989 in the Economics Journal. If I look at citations for that paper, 5 in the first year, maybe 13, 3 years later. So the paper went unnoticed, but it's picking up in citations. It's just gone over 10,000 citations, and it's getting about 2 citations per day at the moment. I say that with great glee, ha ha ha. But on the strength of that paper, I was asked or got to publish a version in Scientific American. And on the strength of that, the idea, which still wasn't accepted in 1990 in economics fully, well, I don't know, got accepted in Silicon Valley. And I was asked to give a talk at Sun Microsystems on positive feedbacks, increasing returns, what we now call network effects. And so I went down to Sun. I thought there'd be 30 engineers there with pocket protectors and, rather uptight guys. A couple of decades earlier, they might have had slide rules, maybe 30 people, maybe 40. When I got down there was something like 800. And they'd read the Scientific American article. And among them was a guy called Eric Schmidt, who wound up running Google, and several other luminaries, Bill Joy. These were all in the audience. I charged a very small amount of money for this. And later, Eric Schmidt took me out to lunch. I said, what do you want to talk to me about, Eric? This is before Google days. Oh, well, I just wanted to let you know, we launched Java based on your ideas. And we want to know what we can do for you in return. I should have said options. And stupidly, I didn't. I said, look, Sun Microsystems has Spark machines. Give me the highest computer, high end. So they did. I got a Spark too. I don't know if this means anything to you. Didn't mean anything to me. I couldn't program the damn thing. And eventually I just gave it to the Santa Fe Institute as tax deduction. And there were nerds at SFI who could program this thing. I couldn't. Similarly, there were a lot of, Andy Grove wanted to meet me. Intel wanted me to give 10 lectures to their top people, etc. I suddenly became a hero in Silicon Valley because what I was basically saying, under increasing returns, if you can maneuver or engineer an advantage early on, you will build up a user base. If you've built up a user base, you can lock in the whole market. And so the result is Google or Facebook. Google's competing as a search engine early on with Alta Vista and with Netscape. There's another one as well. Yes. And Facebook's competing with MySpace, etc. I mean, you can see how nerdy I am. I don't really even remember these. But if you can get enough advantage early on, you get a user base. If you get a user base, if enough people are using Facebook, I remember asking my son quite a long time ago, 15 years ago or something, I said, MySpace is going to take over. And he said, no. I said, well, what do you think? He says, no, it's going to be Facebook. I said, why? He said, because that's what all my friends are using. So these are unstable markets. The more people use Facebook, the more you need to use Facebook. Similarly with the larger companies, there's increasing returns. I had been told time after time in these reviews and by colleagues at Stanford, this increasing returns work is interesting, but it's kind of like black holes in the 1930s. We don't think it really exists. Well, typewriter keyboards, all right, languages, okay. But these are all trivial examples. They don't matter. These are curiosa. They're trivialities. I was walking down the street, I remember, from a car park to teach the very first summer school in Santa Fe Institute in 1988. And it occurred to me that, as I was walking down, I thought, oh my God, all of high tech, we don't use the word high these days, all of tech, or high tech, this is 1988, runs according to increasing returns. Oh my God. I wrote that in a Harvard Business Review article, the one that Steve mentioned, 1996, the one that was edited by and rewritten by Cormac McCarthy. So I tell, I'm sure you know Cormac Honor. Yeah. He was my office mate, and we spent 4 days rewriting that article. What Steve didn't tell you was I was boasting about this at the Santa Fe Institute, that this famous author had rewritten my piece, or shown me how to rewrite it. And the word got through to the Harvard Business Review people. My editor calls me. She says, I heard your pieces got edited and rewritten. I said, yep, by Cormac McCarthy. I said, yeah. What did he do to it? I said, well, it now starts with two young guys in Texas on horses who discover increasing returns. So anyway, let me finish up here. And the idea not only became popular in Silicon Valley, but there was a tech frenzy in 1999. Everybody and their uncle was doing startups, and they were doing these, they were arguing in front of venture capitalists. Well, we know that if you get enough user base, you're going to come out on top and dominate the whole market. We don't look very impressive, but we're going to go after user base. So just give us $50 million, and we'll grab all the user base we can, and we'll dominate the market. We're going to be the next Microsoft, or you wouldn't have said Facebook quite then. We'll be the next whatever, like Google. The problem is they might have had 19 other rivals who'd be saying the same thing, and 19 people or 19 firms are going to lose. One is going to come out on top. How's MySpace doing? Have you been on that recently? What about Alta Vista? Have you looked at that recently, etc.? But that was all forgotten. There was a frenzy, and in the press I started to get blamed that I had fanned the flames with all these increasing returns hopes. I wrote a little piece saying, if you're in an increasing returns market, the chances are you're going to lose. But you might not lose. And so I started to talk about what I call the halls of production, diminishing returns economy, and the casino of technology. I imagined in each technology game that was starting up like search engines, there'd be a table. You go up to the croupier at the table, and you sit at the table and say, I'm going to play this game of search engines. Whatever the year was, 1995 or something. And the croupier is always French. The croupier says, oh, you are very welcome to join us. And you say, okay, does it cost anything to ante up? And the croupier says, oh, yes, you can ante up. That will be $4 billion, please. So you ante up, and you say, what are the rules of this game? We do not know. We do not know what the game will be. Okay, well, I'm still in. I think I'm pretty smart. Who's going to show up and play? And the croupier says, we do not know. And do you think there'll be government regulations? The croupier says, sir, do you still want to play this game? But so I call that the casino of technology. And my God, that was Silicon Valley right there. And so everybody now talks about network effects and lock-in. I went to a McKinsey, teaching session, actually in Amsterdam. And the teaching session, guy was teaching network effects and lock-in. I walked in the back of the audience. This was about when I first knew Jan. And I walked in the back of the audience, and this guy was really good. He explained it better than I could. But my name was never mentioned. At the very end, I thought, I'm going to take advantage of this. I walked up and I said, thanks very much. I said, your colleague said I could sit at the back. He says, oh, not at all. Who are you? I said, I'm Brian Arthur. He turned white. Anyway, so the last thing I want to say is that, things have come out. This is now in textbooks. It's now taken for granted. But the moral I want to draw from this particular session, just to finish it, is to say that what sort of economy are we looking at here? If you believe there's lots of positive feedbacks as well as negative feedbacks, it's an economy that's not necessarily optimal. We could have locked into inferior technologies, and indeed we did. It's an economy where small historical events, Queen Anne in England liked tea. Before that, people in England drank coffee. This might have been around 1805. And thou, great Anna, whom three realms obey, doth sometimes counsel take, and sometimes tay. She drank Chinese tea. England locks into tea. Somebody more fashionable by the 1960s drinks coffee. Now we all drink coffee. Mr. Starbuck or whoever it was that invented that. Anyway, we're in an economy that I would say is like anybody's life. You do something, you lock in, there are historical circumstances, you take a job in Singapore, you might take up and marry somebody. Whatever it is, your life is historically dependent. If you're, you might say it's non-ergodic, if you like that expression. There's no single path, non-ergod or ergodos. But you're locked in to many pathways, and they're always branching, and one thing leads to another. So this is already quite far away from the Berkeley scenario I was describing you earlier, where there's one big cornflakes bowl and the economy is always uniquely in one place, and it doesn't matter how you got there, history doesn't count, and that's perfectly efficient. We are not in an efficient system. There's no way that my life is efficient. It's one circumstance after another. I met somebody, a professor of mine, I said, this was in 1969, I said, I've applied for 12 jobs for the summer, can't get it accepted in any of them. It was during the Vietnam War. I said, I don't have clearance to work at RAND, I'm not an American, etc. He said, well, let me call Dave Hertz in McKinsey & Company. Do you speak any languages? I said, I can speak some German and some French. That was good enough. McKinsey interviewed me in New York, in German, for 6 hours, and my life was different after that. That's probably a good place to quit. Thanks for your patience, Jan, and thank you.
Thank you, Brian. We started a little late, so we finished a little late, and we finished a little later again, but that's okay. We still have about 20 minutes or 25 minutes for questions and discussions with Brian. Who would raise his fingers first? Yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much for the talk. I especially enjoyed going through a history lesson of all the things that happened before me, and then the context that to how your ideas emerge. I'm just thinking that governments around the world are trying to create Silicon Valleys of their own in their own country. Given the path-dependent argument that you made, are they bound to fail, given that the fields are already structured?
Sure.
Yeah.
If I had if I were allowed an answer in 3 letters, I would say yes, but I'll give you a lengthier answer. if governments are trying to set up their own Silicon Valley, homegrown, is that bound to fail? The answer is a little bit more complicated. I was writing, you'll hear in the fourth talk I'm giving about technology, but I made a very detailed study of Silicon Valley. In fact, I've been in Stanford since 1982, so I've seen close to 40 years worth of Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley didn't start in the 1950s or 40s, as I was told, Hewlett-Packard. It started in 1907 with a firm called Pacific Telegraph. And that firm started promising to do wireless telegraph for US naval ships offshore. And the first venture capitalist in that firm was Stanford University. Stanford gave quite a bit of money. Fred Terman was connected with them. In due course, Shockley, who invented this semiconductor at Bell Labs, had been a summer intern there, etc. The guy who invented triode vacuum tubes, Lee DeForest, came out to help. And eventually, a continuous wave amplifier did come out. I'm not sure it was from this particular firm. The point is that it took about 50 or 60 years of organic growth to get Silicon Valley. Why is Silicon Valley where it is? In fact, I used to get caught up in this question emotionally. Why is it at Stanford? Why isn't it at Berkeley? I mean, Berkeley was the top dog long before Stanford. The answer is that it could have been almost anywhere. It could have been possibly in Oregon, but what fed Silicon Valley was that Stanford University was open to their guys, to their alums setting up firms. Fred Terman was the provost of Stanford. He gave lab space to his pupils, names like Hewlett and Packard, grad students. These were the Sergey Brins of the day. They set up companies, Hewlett-Packard and other companies. And the whole thing, and this is what I want to stress, Silicon Valley grew organically. So if you think in terms of, you can read journal articles, you can read engineering magazines, and you can set up a Silicon Valley. I went to Finland to see if that was possible. I was sent there by the World Bank. Not easy. What is organic about it? So think it's more like getting a rock garden to work or a little ecology, an ecological park in part of Africa. You can water it if it's a rock garden, or you can weed out things, you can see what's taking. But the thing about Silicon Valley is it's about people. The expertise resides in their head. If you could get all those people and transport them wherever, maybe to Singapore, in the 1950s, and precisely those people, and people similarly trained, you might be able to plant a Silicon Valley here. I don't know, but I think it's all about people, and in the end, high-tech is not science. High-tech is what I call deep craft. It's knowing what to do, it's knowing what not to do. For the last 20 years, I've been with Xerox PARC. That's where I work, in the system sciences lab there. If you don't know something, you go down the corridors. I need to do some etching 3 microns because I'm laying down a certain circuit. Do you know anyone who does? Oh yeah, Fred down the corridor knows about that. You go to Fred and you say, here's what I'm planning to do. And Fred says, that'll never work. Why? We tried that 10 years ago. Let me tell you what does work. So this is the whole craft thing. And that's very much Silicon Valley. Very hard to plant that. And Silicon Valley is full of spin-offs. I don't know if it's like a mangrove swamp or something like that. But Shockley's basic transistor team didn't get along with Shockley. So they walked out, very famously. And they started Fairchild Semiconductor. And people left that and started Intel. And people left that. So these are all little pods growing. The whole thing's organic. And the main message I want to give you in this talk, and the third one, is that the economy isn't a machine. You can't easily start it up. It's organic. You can transplant stuff, etc. I don't know, the nearest thing I've seen to Silicon Valley is in China, Shenzhen. It's a fantastic place. I don't quite know if they've got it, but the energy's there, and it may take off, and there are other hopes. Singapore is by no means elementary, and Singapore's got really 2 top universities. I've forgotten the name of the other one, but it's pretty good. And it has top engineering, and that's really how you grow these things. You get people who know stuff, but the stuff may not even be in textbooks. You know, ask yourself, if you want to understand how you get a Silicon Valley, where did rock and roll come from? Where did jazz come from? Where did certain type of poetry come from? It's the same process. Very hard to do top down. In fact, if Steve doesn't mind if I tell this story, I'm sitting in the president's office in NTU about 6 years ago, and someone says, in fact, it was Su Guaning, the president of NTU, and he says, all right, we're going to start this Complexity Institute. Where do he says, but where are we going to get the ideas and the projects from? So I sort of, hand waving. Oh, I said, all that'll come bottom up, you know, from people like you, postdocs, pre-docs, smart people, even maybe professors. So all of this is going to come bottom up. Dead silence in the room, and because bottom up, and I hope you don't take that as critical, but it's not exactly a Confucian concept, let me delicately say. So there's silence. And then finally, Guaning breaks through the silence. He says, yes, he said, bottom up. We can arrange that. That's another question.
Okay. Next question or comment.
Thank you. I actually wanted to come back to a question you actually asked yourself at the very beginning of the talk. I think you said, and I paraphrase, what I wish I knew when I was 24 or 30 years old. I don't think, if I'm right, I don't think you addressed that. Maybe you could touch back on that.
Okay. I planted this guy in the audience. I was watching last night Lord of the Rings, where Frodo starts off and says, I'm going to take the ring into Mordor. That's what I learned. I learned that you think that all of this is going to be easy, it's going to be simple, but you know, there's big spiders and stuff along the way. I thought that if you, one key thing I've learned, and I'm sure if you're a bit older, you know this automatically in science. I didn't. I thought if you had a very good idea, bells would ring and you'd be carried in on people's shoulders and so on. No, the main thing I learned is that there's a pacing to science, and at first, if an idea is sufficiently different, it's regarded as, you know, it's okay, but, you know, this isn't fill in the blank. This isn't obstetrics. This is not linguistics. And I've seen so many examples of that. I remember Greenstein at Stanford had formulated a very different way of doing linguistics, the ancestry of languages. And I hope I got his name right. And for decades he was an outcast. It turns out that he was very much on target. So unfamiliarity and lack of, say, the question I thought I'd solved, and I think I did solve, was how do you deal with increasing returns problems? Well, you make them into stochastic processes. You say small events are going to sway the outcome. Then you can well define them. But when I sent that to journals, nobody had heard of the increasing returns problem. So I'd solved a problem that nobody had written down. And I'm not saying, and I'll give you other examples as we go along. I wish I had known that. Now I do. And if you're wondering where you can really learn about doing science and about careers, I would say read and read and read biographies. It was after all of this. I had hair that was the color of yours before this started. I went gray trying to get this thing published. I think that I just wish I had studied more biographies early on. And the enemy is not people's stupidity. It's not at all. It's unfamiliarity. Saying, well, this isn't really a problem. I mean, what are you trying to do here? And occasionally people would say, I get what you're trying to do, but I don't like that direction. You're trying to take economics in. Stefan?
Stefan, and then you?
I am not a scientist or an economist, so this
Good.
might be a naive question, but I was wondering if things are not, or systems are not as predictable as we think they are. And I can see like this, I think it's very beautiful to see the world in an organic way and small things affecting each other contingently. But predicting or being able to predict things in a deterministic Newtonian world have been able to allow us to base or to create models through which we can understand the world. So
Yep.
if we look at the world in this kind of organic way, then how do we then create models off of that? So how is that possible?
Yeah. Well, these are all excellent questions. My answer to that would be the world is organic. Doesn't mean it's chaotic. It doesn't mean you can't predict anything. The world is, and I find this is comforting, world is partially predictable. We can predict the orbits of planets very well. If you're very good at psychology, you may be able to predict with other people how they're going to react. We can predict an awful lot. But the predictions are not perfect. There was definitely a view in the 1700s, like around 1750, that the world was ordered, and if we knew the mechanisms well enough, we could predict everything. Now we're finding out that if there are nonlinear systems, earthquake systems, for example, this, triggers that, might trigger this or might not, then the world isn't totally predictable. So I'm more comfortable saying that things are reasonably well ordered, things are, some aspects of things are predictable, and some aren't. And I think that for me that gives more of a world that I like. History matters. You know, if Steve Jobs hadn't talked to somebody called Wozniak and they hadn't tried to do something, I'll give you this example. Jobs and Wozniak visited where I work, Xerox PARC, one day. There were two managers decided whether they'd allow the visit. One of them was a male and said, yeah, they can come and visit. They're just a couple of kids who are hobbyists. The other one was smarter, the woman, and she said, they're going to come in, and if we let them romp around park, they're going to steal our technology. But they let them in, and they saw I think it was the Alta, Park's computer, and jobs. And Wozniak went back and reverse engineered that and produced something they called the Macintosh. And that was a knockoff of Park. Anyway, the point is that these are tiny events. And Apple is now, I haven't checked recently, but I think it's the largest company in the world. And if they hadn't had that knockoff, it would be different. So I like that it's not totally predictable.
Is biology working differently in some, or is it also working along the same lines of increasing returns?
I think that let me put it this way, I bet you could answer that better than I can, because there are people in this audience know a lot more biology, but I'll probably think of a good answer for you in 2 days' time. What I would say at the moment is that any field you take, it could be some field in physics or in epidemiology or something, generally those systems have a mixture of increasing returns or positive feedbacks and a mixture of negative feedbacks. In the case of biology, just take species, there are many cases in which species, once they get established, they're very hard to invade. Vaguely, species of carp that were in, I don't know if it's carp, but introduced into, what is it, Lake Tanganyika? It's my own ignorance here. But you introduce one species of fish, it's wiped out all the others. So you see a lot of this in biology. There's something in biology called competitive exclusion. If you have enough of one species, it'll wipe out anything that's similar to it. I don't know to what degree that holds up empirically, but I would say this, that's a mixture of positive and negative feedbacks is all through biology, genetic regulatory networks, etc., but particularly in competitions among species. In fact, I got these ideas from biology. It was Jacques Monod saying if you have positive feedbacks, whole patterns could get locked in at the molecular level. Once you have a replication mechanism which goes way, way back in time in biology, maybe 4 billion years or more, there's no other mechanism that's going to find it easy to get a toe in. So we're full of these historical accidents that lock in. That creates the structure for the next set of things to happen.
Hi, thanks so much for this. My question actually builds on the lady in front, but it's about decision making. So if there are 54 factorial possible permutations of a given outcome, how do you make decisions? Let's say if you're in government and you need to make some kind of policy that will affect a lot of people. How do you go about doing that in a way that's, I don't know a better word than practical, although that's a terrible word.
That's consonant with what you just heard. I don't know. How do you make decisions at the governmental level? I have 2 or 3 observations. One is that if you know that these systems can lock in, that some standard may lock in, you can gently nudge a system. If it's teetering on the boundary and you say, oh, it could go this way. For example, you can get into a cycle of positive feedback with name calling between America and Russia at the moment. Well, possibly you can nudge the system in a way that's into a better cycle of solutions. Also, I've come away, I was sort of taught that economies and these decisions, economies could be looked on as gigantic, like electrical power systems or something. These big dials and levers, and behind some glass wall, all of this stuff is happening. But in the Singapore government, you can pull this lever, that. after, and you'll hear more in the third talk, but after thinking of it that way, yeah, to some degree, you can maybe control the roads system and traffic maybe that way. Singapore does a very good job of that, it seems, or a reasonably good one. But I tend to think that economies are more like, I'm trying to think of the word, they're more like nature reserves. You can put fences here, you can bring in new species, you can replant here, you can wall off things, you can encourage this or discourage that, a bit like rock gardens, and you can sort of organically replant and fence off, but it's very imperfect. And I think and also if you were to say to me, well, this is all, you know, I've just heard from this talk that the capitalist system doesn't lead to the best of all possible worlds. If you leave it to itself, all kinds of things happen, and we lock into large, you know, large companies. Facebook's one, where the last couple of weeks we haven't been that pleased with the outcome. I would say to first order capitalist systems do deliver, but you can't say they're perfect. And America doesn't, at least 20 years ago during the Cold War, 30 years ago, it did not like that thought. We are superior, we are the best. And the amusing thing was that the Soviet system thought the same. I think planned capitalism a la China is doing very well. Hands-off capitalism, which is more in the West, not perfectly hands-off, is doing pretty well too. So the economy does tend to reasonably good solutions, but get away from thinking this is perfect. And governments can intervene here and intervene there. But if you follow this sort of reasoning, you need good timing. Where is something just teetering on the edge because it might be too late? It's too late now for Singapore to say, we don't want to use English as a common language. But it could have said that maybe 50 years ago. I don't know. It could have said, well, we're going to use heavily go Chinese and let English gradually die. I don't know. But timing counts for a lot.
Any other questions? If not, then I think we should thank Brian once again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian, once again.
Oh, thank you.
And join us for coffee.
Thank you.